a treat for me to be here. I'm Tom Friedman from the New York Times, and our guest, of course, is Marwan Muasher, former Jordanian deputy prime minister and foreign minister and ambassador and so many other good things. But most importantly, the author of The Second Arab Awakening. And that's what we're here to discuss this morning. And Marwan, I want to dive right in with a simple question. Is the Arab Awakening over?
I don't think it has hardly begun. I think people were too quick to call it an Arab Spring 3 years ago, expecting that just because you topple an autocratic leader, democracy is going to flourish overnight. And now people are too quick to call it an Arab inferno and to say that it's over. This is a historical process that I think needed to happen, and it's not going to unfold in 3 short years. Look at the Ukraine. I mean, it's still going on strong 10 years after the first Orange Revolution. So I think it is way too early to judge where this is going. I also think that the status quo in the Arab world was not sustainable. Basically, the stability that everybody talked about in the Arab world was artificial. It was stability brought about by brute force. And now that the lid has been lifted, it is natural that we're going to see all these issues and challenges. Some of them are not going to end well. Other countries will struggle, and yet others will succeed. I keep saying 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Poland is not doing the same as Bulgaria or Romania. So this is a process that is going to take not years, but decades, and will not end up in the same place for every country of the Arab world.
That's a good segue to my second question, Marwan, which is, why has Tunisia, I saw 2 questions about Tunisia. Isn't it interesting that the Arab country that the United States has had the least involvement with has done the best? And is there a connection? And on its own, why does it feel like Tunisia, and maybe in its own way Yemen, I start to wonder, seem to be finding a way, an inclusive path to consolidate the gains of the Arab Spring after a lot of, stop and start, a lot of failures, and even some violence?
Well, let's look at some different models of transition that the Arab world is going through. And let me not name the country first, but talk about the process and attempt to answer your question this way. We have, no transition has gone the same way. But if we just pick 3 for argument's sake, and let's not name the country for now. One has been adopted an inclusionist approach. They formed a coalition government. They worried about the constitution first, so that they, can come up with a Bill of Rights, if you will, that everybody can subscribe to. They kept the army away. The army did not interfere in the process. They had a lot of tension and problems among them until they figured out that the only way forward is not to fight each other, but to actually jointly come up with an agreement. And what has the result been? A constitution today that is by far the most forward-looking constitution in the Arab world, a constitution that upholds total parity, between men and women, upholds the principle of a peaceful rotation of power at all times, and get this, for the first time in the Arab world, upholds the right to believe or not to believe. Agreed to by the Islamist force in society, not just by the secular forces. That, of course, is Tunisia. You compare that with a second model, I call it the convoluted model, or the exclusionist model, in which everybody thinks they have a monopoly on truth, and they think that they can ignore or suppress other forces in society. And so when they come to power, they engage in this winner-take-all strategy in a zero-sum game where they attempt to push forward their points of view to the exclusion of all others. The Islamists did it last year when they were in power. The secular forces are doing it this year. Basically, as I said, ignoring all other forces in society. And the result has been, so far, zero. In a zero-sum game, the sum truly has been zero. The country is not doing well. It continues to suffer from security problems, economic problems, etc. And that country, of course, is Egypt. And then you have a third model where you have a regime that will stop at nothing to kill its people in a basically existential game. You have an opposition which has not been united. You have a security vacuum that has been exploited by the radical groups who basically largely came from outside the country on both sides, the Sunni and the Shiite side. And today you have a horrific war, 150,000 people killed and counting. And that model is Syria. What is the point? The point is it is already clear to the Arab world which way to go if they want stability and which way to go if they want war and chaos. It is clear. You can pick a Tunisian model, you can pick a Syria model, and all variations in between. So far, Tunisia has been, I can't say the exception, because Yemen is,
Yemen's
doing
underestimated.
that. Morocco is doing relatively well also. So it's not true that we've only seen chaos and negative developments in the Arab world. I think one of the most important positive elements of the Arab uprising so far is that they have basically did away with the holiness of the two major forces that have dominated the political scene in the Arab world. The secular forces that ruled the Arab world and made it sacrilegious to criticize their own policies, and the religious opposition, who also made it sacrilegious to criticize their own policies. Today in the Arab world, you can criticize the Islamists any way you want. You can be a liberal. You can be anything you want, and it no longer is the taboo that used to be before the Arab uprisings. That, I think, is positive. The fear is gone. Now, what do we do with this, and where do you take it is another issue.
I love that description of the three. I think that's really a positive. And to your last point, Marwan, it reminds me I was in Saudi Arabia in December, and Saudi Arabia today is one of the, it actually makes sense when you think about it on a per capita basis, highest users of Twitter and YouTube and WhatsApp in the world on a per capita basis. And what you see, if you analyze their Twitter, those with the largest Twitter followings there, the top 5 or 6 are all Wahhabi sheikhs, basically, who are actually using new media to extend their reach. And the next 5 are, coming up from there are people making fun of the Wahhabi sheikhs. So you can actually see what's going on. But your description of those 3 models, I want to step out of the Arab world for a second because we are in Washington. And when you got to the Syria model, I thought, there's one line that in a different form, in a different place, the person sitting in your chair would have added, and it's all Obama's fault. Because if you read the Washington debate about Syria, it's this and that, and but for us sending bigger arms to the opposition early on, Syria would not have taken that course. It's all Obama's fault. Where does American policy fit in here? What is the legitimate criticism of the Obama administration in handling the Arab Spring, and what is actually, believe it or not about us, because people there have agency also?
Whereas I have lots of issues that I can criticize the Obama administration on, and I do. On the Arab uprisings, frankly, Tom, I think this is largely a homegrown process. You cannot cook up democracy overnight. I mean, Bush tried to do it in a very sort of heavy-handed way, and of course it did not succeed. Obama is not interested in doing it at all, I think, after maybe a forthcoming speech in Cairo, but I mean, the United States today is ending up looking at the Middle East from a security prism, maybe almost the same way that the Bush administration has looked at it. But having said that, I'm not frankly quite sure what the United States can do in a major way to affect a historical process that will unfold, as I said, through decades. That doesn't mean it cannot do anything, but whatever it does is going to be marginal to the process. I think it can do no harm, by maybe supporting the process of democratization, but not by supporting individuals, by talking to all groups and not taking sides as it did before. But beyond that, it is really a process that has to be done by the people of the Middle East themselves.
Marwan, one of the things that your book is in the subtitle, and the battle for pluralism. It's an interesting subtitle to your book. You didn't say in the battle for a Bill of Rights, the battle for democracy. You singled out this word pluralism, and it runs through your book because you aren't just talking about, as it were, political pluralism, but educational pluralism and pluralism even in how men and women are related to. Why the emphasis on that word?
Because in my view, pluralism is the prerequisite for everything else that you talk about, for democracy, for respect of others, for institution building, for tolerance. And let me first say that when I mention pluralism, I mean four specific things. I mean political pluralism and the right of everybody to operate and the peaceful rotation of power at all times. I mean religious pluralism. The Arab world is a very diverse world, ethnically and religiously. I mean cultural pluralism. And I also mean, I don't know if you can say gender pluralism, but total equality between men and women. That in itself does not guarantee a prosperous and stable society, but it's a necessary condition. If you don't believe in pluralism, you see what is happening in Egypt, where everybody thinks that just because they win an election, they have the right to dictate their views on all of society. If you don't believe in pluralism, then it becomes, a winner-take-all strategy, and whoever wins that battle becomes the new dictator of the Arab world. If you don't believe in pluralism, then you become a selective Democrat, only agreeing with democracy when the results are to your liking. Otherwise, you're not a Democrat. That is not a formula to result in stable and prosperous societies. That is why pluralism, I think, is very important. And that is why I call it second Arab awakening. There was a first Arab awakening in which the battle was won for independence. Arab intellectuals of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century worried about independence from Ottoman rule and independence then from colonial rule. And all their energies were focused on getting and gaining independence, and the Arab world did. But once it did, it stopped there. There was no serious move by any Arab government, monarchies and republics alike, progressive and conservative alike. There was no move to put in place institutions that would guarantee pluralistic and democratic societies. And today we are paying the price of not having gone on that route 70 or 80 years later. I mean, those who say today in the Arab world, we told you so, the Arab uprisings have failed to tell us that, it is precisely because of their policies that we are witnessing what we are witnessing today. It's precisely because the political space was closed that we don't have, different points of view and different political parties offering different solutions to the problems that face the Arab world today. That is why it has to be a battle for pluralism, where the battle should be between those who believe in everybody's right to operate and those who don't, not those who are secular and those who are Islamist. If it becomes a battle between secular forces and Islamist forces, then, as I said, whoever wins the battle becomes the new dictator.
Now, you plan to take this message back to Jordan and to work politically there. How do you think it'll be received?
It depends on, it depends on the constituency. The old guard was not going to receive it well. The issue of pluralism is not an issue that the old guard, not just in Jordan, by the way, but throughout the Arab world, is interested in. The Arab world, much of the Arab world, has been built on patronage systems, on layers around rulers who, give their loyalty to the rulers in return for privileges that they get. Pluralism talks about a merit-based system. Pluralism talks about the right of everybody to, enjoy the rule of law equally for all citizens. This is not a message that the old guard is interested in. And frankly, it is probably not a message that the Islamists are interested in either. Whenever you talk about pluralism, you talk about relative truths. You don't talk about absolute truths. You talk about different points of view. You talk about, tolerance and respect for other points of view. That's not something that the traditional Islamist forces or the traditional forces in the Arab world will like. But I tell you, fortunately, much of the Arab world is under 30 years of age. 70% of the Arab world is under 30 years of age. And I believe strongly that this is a message that will resonate with the youth of the Arab world. They are still frustrated, leaderless, without clear programs. But they are the majority. And they are the constituency that one has to work with, I believe, and work with for decades. This is not something that you do for a year or two and expect quick results. This is something that has to be done on the ground for many, many decades without expecting results. And it's not something you do to win elections overnight. This is a discourse that I think needs to be developed and developed with the young generation. But also a discourse that does not stop at ideology. Okay, I mean, we've suffered in the Arab world from too much emphasis on ideology and too little emphasis on socio-economic development. And so we moved in the Arab world, if you will, from a period that just came after independence, where, Pan-Arabism, Ba'athism, Nasserism, all these isms, right, secular isms, right, promised heaven to the Arab world, promised the liberation of Palestine, promised socio-economic development, etc. And of course, did not get the liberation, nor did they get socio-economic development. And after 1967, when we lost the war with Israel, a new ism came about, Islamism, where, because they were the only ones that were present at the scene, as the political space was closed by Arab governments, Islam is the solution started to become a popular slogan. Not necessarily because everybody believed in the ideology of Islam, but because people saw in political Islamists, the cleaner, if you want, crowd, people who promised better government, cleaner government, etc. Well, in 3 short years after the Arab uprisings, the Islamists did to themselves, in terms of weakening themselves, more than 50 years of exclusion by Arab secular governments were able to do to them. And today, if you go to anywhere in the Arab world, Islam is the solution today, not just in Egypt. It means much less than it meant three years ago. Why? Because you cannot just talk about ideology. And that is, one of the messages of the book is, if people are to talk, as I do, about pluralism, democracy, human rights, women's rights, etc., this is all good and needed. But one cannot stop there unless you also couple that with real programs that address real problems for people. Then the hope of the second Arab awakening will not be realized.
Before we go to questions, I want to go back to an earlier point you made. Why is Tunisia different from Egypt? And why is Syria different from Tunisia? This was the Arab world. It was everyone speaking Arabic. The majority of people are Muslims. These countries lived together for a long time. Two of them once were fused into a united Arab Republic. Yet they've taken radically different courses. Why?
Well, different factors. Take Tunisia. Tunisia is a small country, relatively homogeneous. I mean, everybody, basically 99% of the country is a Sunni Muslim population. They do have a middle class. They do have a tradition of secular, if you want, principles. The Islamist party in Tunisia is a party that traditionally has been more moderate and forward-looking than any other Islamist party in the Arab world. The army has always been sort of away from politics. So all of these combinations, and probably, we don't know, but probably they learned the lesson from Egypt. They saw where Egypt was heading, and they said, that's not where we want to go. And that is characteristic of many countries in North Africa, of the Arab world, that their societies are relatively homogeneous. Tunisians have thought of themselves as Tunisians long before their modern nation state was created. That, by the way, is true of Egypt as well. I worry more about the eastern part of the Arab world, about the Levant. And that brings us to Syria. Okay, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, Lebanon, all of these are countries that are artificially created. They were created as a result of the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds were put together in the same country without forging any sense of national identity. And the 100 years that separate us from Sykes-Picot have not been invested by Arab governments into forging national identities, to the point where, of course, today, sub-identities in Syria, sub-identities in Iraq, sub-identities in Lebanon always trump national identities. And that is the price that is being paid today. Lebanon paid it in multiple wars. Iraq is paying it today. And, of course, Syria is paying it most horrifically and will probably pay it for some time to come before people understand that, once again, diversity does not mean, a weakness. Diversity should be converted to a strength, but your national identity has to come first. You cannot be a Syrian Christian. You cannot be a Christian before you're a Syrian. That is something that also I think. I mean, let's go back to Tunisia. Women in Tunisia under Bourguiba, right, enjoyed rights that were unprecedented in the Arab world. But these rights were not given to them naturally. These rights were given to them by brute force. And the dictator that gave them that rights took away so many other rights from their fellow citizens. Does that mean that I, as a woman, am to look the other way of all the abuses that this dictator gave to my fellow citizens only because he gave me my rights? Today in Tunisia, women under the new constitution will enjoy more rights than they did under Bourguiba, except this time they got them through a process of inclusion and of fighting for their rights. And today nobody can rob them away from it because they were arrived at through a natural process. When I talk about Syrians let's say Christians in Syria, I mean, if I, as a Christian in Syria, am going to justify what Assad is doing to his people, just because I feel that Assad is going to protect my religious rights, not my political rights, as a Christian, I make myself a minority. I make myself a minority, and I invite people to come attack me at some point in the future because I did not stand with my fellow citizen. You have to act as citizens and not as these sub-identities that are prevailing in the Arab world.
Marwan, what gives you optimism? What should give me optimism? What should give our audience optimism that this won't end the way it's ended for 100 years? You know, I've always said about the Middle East, it's a region where extremists go all the way and moderates tend to just go away. And you are a rare case of, I would say, of a radical moderate. That you're ready to be as passionate, as hard-headed, and as, I would say, persistent in pursuit of moderate and pluralistic goals as extremists are in terms of theirs, obviously not violent. But what makes you think there's anything other than a few other Marwan Muashers out there?
Look, optimism or pessimism is not the name of the game. I mean, I don't believe in optimism or pessimism because these are you can affect where the future of the Arab world goes. If we sit here and say that the Arab world is doomed to failure, we are dooming it to failure because we will be engaged in a self-fulfilling prophecy. You've said it. I mean, the key word is persistence, passion. You have to be passionate and persistent. The radicals are, for sure, and the ruling elites are, for sure. I mean, a person like Assad, has no problem killing 150,000 and more of his people to stay in power. Moderates cannot be passive about this. They have to not just raise their voices, but they have to work on the ground, roll up their sleeves, and do this for decades. This discourse that I talk about is not a discourse that is going to develop on its own in the Arab world, in a region that has not known political pluralism probably ever. And so just because, Mubarak is gone or Ben Ali is gone, it doesn't mean that democracy is going to come on its own in its place. It will come if people work for it. It won't come if people don't. So I shy away from talking about optimism and pessimism. What I say is there is lots of work to be done on the ground. I think my generation probably has failed in doing such work. We are not able to be pluralistic. It's not in our DNA. We were not taught this in school, at home. We were not taught to be pluralistic in the true sense of the word. And if the Arab world is to become pluralistic, you have to work not just with the new generation. You have to work to change the educational system of the Arab world. Not in terms of putting computers in schools, not in terms of improving your math and science scores. All of these are important. But what's crucial is the value system that is being taught. What's crucial is, developing a generation that is able to think critically, to regard truth as relative, to question, to research, to accept other points of view. These are the skills that are needed to create an environment that is conducive to stability and prosperity. That's not going to be done overnight. Booz Allen has a study that says that if Saudi Arabia today does everything right on education, everything right, it will take them 45 years to start seeing the results. So this is not something that, is going to happen overnight. And it's not for the faint-hearted. It's not something that you try for 2 years, and if it fails, you say, I tried and failed. It's not for the faint-hearted. There will be many, many, many failures before successes start coming about. Call it romanticism? Maybe. I mean, I've been called a romantic by many people. I think, actually, The romantics are the people who are not, who just think that democracy is going to flourish on its own, and if it doesn't, they just give up, immediately. These are the romantics.
Well, we'll go to questions, but your conclusion there just reminds me, I'm a fellow romantic, and I actually was in Israel about 8 years ago and having dinner with the editor of Haaretz, which is the Israeli newspaper that runs my column. And I said to him, why do you run my column? He said, Tom, you're the only optimist we have. And there was an Israeli general at the dinner, Uzi Arad, and we were getting up to go to the table, and he pulled me aside. He said, I know why you're an optimist, Tom. I said, really, why? He said, because you're short. And I said, short? He said, yeah, you can only see that part of the glass that's half full. So Marwan, to you. Floor is open. Please identify yourself, and the microphone's right behind you.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician. My question is Syria. Is there anything that can be done to stop the carnage while the sides work it out? A truce? Can we do anything except bring in supplies when people let us?
I struggle to give a positive answer on Syria, and I wish I have one, but I don't. I think that in the short term, there is clearly a situation where neither the Assad regime nor the opposition can win, where the international community in the West, including in the United States, is not interested in intervening beyond what it is doing today. You have the Russians and the Iranians who are pouring in a lot of resources that probably have kept Assad for till now, without which I don't think he would have survived. And that situation is not going to change. And the Ukrainian, for example, crisis has just made it worse. Because if there was any chance of cooperation between the Russians and the Americans on Syria, it is over. Anyway, Geneva too, was attempted, did not result in anything. But with the Ukrainian crisis, I don't see in the foreseeable future, let's say in the next year or two, that there will be any hope of cooperation to put in place a serious political process that would do what you just described. Therefore, I think, for the next year or two, we're going to see, I wish I can even say much of the same, but worse. I mean, the refugee crisis in Syria is unsustainable. 9 million internally displaced refugees. 1/3 of the population is internally displaced. Another 2 to 3 million refugees outside the country. 50% of Syria's GDP has already been lost. If the war ends tomorrow morning in Syria, it will take Syria another 10 years to achieve the Millennium Development Goals that were basically, very basic. Syria has lost a generation at least of development with no end in sight. I wish I have a better answer.
Yeah.
Aya Sehati, Saudi business person. I'd like to ask you about the rift going on now between Qatar and other GCC members. Do you believe that Qatar is interfering with internal affairs or simply just not conforming to the foreign policy that others would like to dictate, one? And what are the implications? Are they positive or negative on which fronts? For whom would it benefit which populations? Thanks.
There has always been the notion that the GCC is united. And that has always been a bit skin deep. I mean, Qatar has not seen eye to eye with Saudi Arabia for some time. Oman has had independent positions, particularly Qatar and Oman, actually, when it came to relations with Iran, that were different than Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. These are political differences, not religious. I mean, today the big rift between Saudi Arabia and Qatar is over which side they are backing in the Syrian crisis and beyond. The Saudis are against the Muslim Brotherhood. The Qataris are with it. But I mean, those Saudis are also supporting Islamist groups that are actually more radical than the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, if you look at political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood is probably the most moderate of any political Islamic movement. So, one, this is political, not religious. And two, of course, it is not helping the Syrian crisis also, because it is only contributing to deepening the rift that already exists among the opposition. And the opposition today is involved in fighting each other with Saudi and Qatari support more than in fighting the Assad regime, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Ricky Goldstein, Human Rights Watch. On Tunisia, I have a more cynical view than you of Tunisia's relative success, which is that Tunisia's great asset is not any kind of inherent moderation of its Islamists or forward-looking society, but rather that the secular forces are quite strong in Tunisia. The forces in between the Islamists and the secular are quite strong. So they had no way to beat each other into submission, but rather had to accommodate one another. And if that's true, it's kind of bodes ill for Egypt, where the secular forces or the non-Islamist forces are still so feeble. My question is about Iraq, which I think is not studied enough when we talk about the Arab Spring. Iraq has had democratic elections and yet is in utter shambles in many respects. What do you think? Is there a learning curve in Iraq? Are we groping towards something better? And what are the lessons for other countries about what's happening in Iraq, which is a multicultural
I think the main lesson from Iraq, in my view, is that you don't build a democracy along sectarian lines. And you don't emulate the Lebanese model if you want to build a national democracy. What has happened in Iraq is when, what's his name now, Bremer first came, in the U.S. attempt to be fair to all the different communities in Iraq, they put in place a system, right, where, again, maybe in an attempt to ensure fair representation for the Shiites, for the Sunnis, and for the Kurds, what they did instead is installed a system that is based on, sectarian basis. And so today, 10 years after this has been done, 10 years after the war in Iraq, you really don't have any national political parties in Iraq. You have Shiite parties, you have Sunni parties, and you have Kurdish parties. And even when Iyad Allawi attempted to have a semi-secular, if you want, party, they all ganged up on him and did not allow him to basically claim what has been his legal right, is to form the government after he won the elections. That's the main lesson. Don't do anything on sectarian lines. Look where Lebanon is today. I think what has been, I keep saying, what is worse than Sykes-Picot is if we dismantle Sykes-Picot. And all this talk today about dividing countries into sort of ethnically pure states, a Shiite state, a Christian state, Kurdish state, etc. What this will do is, of course, further the wars and the chaos that exist in the Middle East.
I would just pick up on that, because I think there's actually one more lesson of Iraq, though, Marwan, that actually reinforces your case. I always thought if I were back in graduate school now, my PhD thesis would be called Iraqi Elections 2010. Because what happened in those elections was Iraqis actually demanded multi-sectarian parties. That's why Alawi and Maliki both had to run on multi-sectarian lists. And the guy who had the most multi-sectarian party actually won. And so that was a bottom-up pressure, and I think little understood. And then we left. Yeah, right over there.
Dan Kurtzer, Princeton University. Marwan, you have a compelling vision. I don't. You have a compelling vision for the long term, and you have a very smart way of looking at discourse in the shorter term. What do you tell dictators, though, about governance in the short term? You're speaking to General el-Sisi, likely President el-Sisi. What do you say to him about opening up the political space in a fractious society?
It's interesting. I was just talking to Tom before we started, and he quoted, can I mention
Please,
the guy? He quoted something that Salam Fayyad told him after the Arab uprisings. With all this money that is now being poured to sort of reverse, slow down, stop, whatever you want to call it, the Arab uprisings.
Buy off citizens.
Buying off of citizens, basically, whether it is money in the Gulf, whether it is money in Egypt, etc. And Salam Fayyad said, you know what, Tom? It's cheaper to hold an election. That's the point. The point is, gone are the times of absolute power. The Arab uprisings, if there is anything that the Arab uprisings did, is to establish this point. Absolute power is no more. So countries that have not undergone transition do have a choice. They either share their power or risk losing it. But the option of keeping absolute power for the indefinite future is gone, in my view. I understand perfectly that the argument that if you want to keep your power, you need to share it, is not easy to internalize, right? It's never easy to internalize. But that's reality, in my view. And that is actually one of my main concerns, is with countries that have not undergone transition in the Arab world. They cannot deal with this through money or through ad hoc reforms. They have to put in place a gradual, there's no question about it, a gradual but serious reform process that ends up in power sharing, that ends up in diluting the dominance of the executive branch, in strengthening parliaments, in strengthening the judicial branches, in putting in place, the basic pillars of democracy that we all know about. Will they do it? I have my doubts. I wish they will. And I think the lessons are there for all to see. But unfortunately, many of them look at what has happened in the Arab world and use the fact that Syria, Egypt, other countries are undergoing turmoil, and saying to themselves, this is the alternative, guys. If you want this, we'll do a reform process. That's not reading the leaves the right way. They used this fact with the Islamists for the longest time. It's either us or the Islamists. The Islamists, what's the word? The Islamists the Islamist monster has gone. Okay? Yeah. It's gone. I mean, whereas I'm not saying the Islamists have disappeared. They will not disappear. But I claim that if the Islamists are to remain popular from now on, they have to evolve, just as everybody else has to evolve. They have to worry about problems, not ideology. 70% of Egyptians want their government to worry about the economy. 2% want their government to worry about ideology. Talk to any taxi driver in Egypt and he will tell you this: I do not want my government to tell me how to be a Muslim. I'm perfectly capable of exercising my religion. Let them worry about the economy. So that scare tactic can no longer be used. Unfortunately, it is still being used. If it's not with the Islamists, it's with the chaos and war in Syria or Egypt.
Dan, just to pick up on Marwan's point, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. But those who don't study the present are condemned to miss it. And I was just in Saudi Arabia again in December, and the most popular Twitter hashtag in Saudi Arabia is "what I would say to the king." And I think it's very revealing because it's what is new. And what is new is that every leader today, by the way, Putin will learn this lesson too, is in a two-way conversation. There's no more one-way conversation. Sisi will learn this, Putin will learn it. And I think that's the biggest structural change that Marwan is pointing to. Yeah.
Thank you. Ghaith Al-Omari from the American Task Force in Palestine. I want to remain on the Islamists issue. And I mean, you described two models, Egypt and Tunisia. From the outside, it looks to us Tunisia is a success and Egypt is a failure. Yet, if I was the base of the Muslim Brotherhood, if I was the base constituency, I would look at Tunisia as an unpalatable case of compromise, and it's always hard to sell compromise. And we know Al-Nahda is being faced now with strong pushback from within its ranks. On the other hand, in Egypt, it reinforces an old discourse of victimization and what have you. So my question to you, descriptively, which do you think is gaining more traction? The Egyptian model or the Tunisian model? And prescriptively, what can external players do to affect the outcome? And not only, I'm not talking about the US as an external player. I'm talking about seculars and what have you, and not only in Egypt and Tunisia, but more importantly, places like Jordan, Kuwait, where there are places which are not in the heat of the battle. Thank you.
When we talk about any country, including Tunisia, I am not suggesting that everything is rosy and positive. Of course, I mean, how can it be all rosy and positive in 3 short years in a country that has not known democracy for ever? How can it be? However, Ghaith, if elections are held tomorrow morning in Tunisia, the Islamists will lose. According to all the polls, they will not disappear, but they will no longer be the dominant party that they were 3 years ago. But this time, this is achieved by the ballot box. By the ballot box. And it will send huge repercussions throughout the rest of the Arab world, that the Islamists actually can come to power and leave by the ballot box. In Egypt, if the elections were held in Egypt without the interference of the military, probably they would have had a similar result. But the Egyptians chose to, do it the military way, right? So as a secular force, if the seculars win, I am for democracy. If the Islamists win, I'm not for democracy. What am I doing? I am giving the Islamists the right, when they do come to power, to negate my own existence. So you ask me which model is gaining traction? Absolutely the Tunisian model. The IMF last year published a study which showed that in any transition across the world, it takes an average of 5 years for all the major economic indicators to come back to their pre-transition levels. So if you look at unemployment, if you look at growth, if you look at budget deficit, take any indicator you want, it will take 5 years, whether the Islamists or the seculars or whoever comes to power, will need 5 years to go back to pre-transition levels. And that, of course, is a message that nobody seems to have grabbed except the Tunisians, which is that anybody who rules alone after a transition is going to pay for it. And the Egyptians paid for it, or the Islamists in Egypt paid for it. Now, Tunisia has stopped the deterioration economically. If you look at the economic indicators in Tunisia, if you look at the growth rates, if you look at the budget deficit, if you look, The deterioration has stopped, and they are on their way up. If you look at Egypt, the deterioration has not stopped. Even with $18 billion so far and counting that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have given Egypt, because all of this money, or most of it, have gone to subsidize the subsidies, meaning money down the drain that is not doing anything to reform the country economically. It's clear.
I want to make sure I get this part of the room. That young lady there, yeah.
So happy that Young was included
When you're
in there.
60,
Thank you. Julie Hughes from NDI. When will your book be available in Arabic for sale in the Middle East?
It is already being translated now.
Great.
And I expect it to be probably in June. Probably in June. But thank you for asking this, because that's, I mean, I love you guys to read my book, but I would love the Arab world to read it too.
Over here.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Marwan, for this. Tom, you said at the beginning that Tunisia, where there is the least American involvement, has done better. Can you please explain why you think that's the situation, and compare it to, and Marwan too, if you can have also some opinion on this. Also, compared to Egypt, where America had the most involvement, the strongest relationship, the most money poured in Egypt for the last 40, 50 years. How do you explain that? Thank you.
I'll give a short answer, and I'll rely on Marwan to give the long answer. But Marwan, for me, already alluded to it, which is that for 50 years we bought into the argument, or certainly for the last 30 under Mubarak, that it's either me or the Islamists. So we said, you're the Islamists, we'll take you. And because we were so obsessed with preserving Camp David, that reinforced it. So whoever, we basically treated the Arab world, in my view, for 50 years as a collection of big gas stations. Saudi station, Libya station, Iraq station, Egypt station, Kuwait station. And we told them all the same thing. We said, guys, it's only guys. Guys, here's the deal. Keep your pumps open. Your price is low. And don't bother the Yehudis too much. And you can do whatever you want out back, okay? You can treat your women however you like, deprive your people whatever civil rights you want, print whatever crazy conspiracies and theories in your newspapers that you like, preach whatever from your mosques that you like. Just keep your pumps open, your price is low, and don't bother Israel too much, okay? And that was our philosophy. And so we got two shocks. First was 9/11. Because all the pathologies out back were distilled into bin Laden. And then we got the shock of the Arab Spring, that the people out back weren't going to take it anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sure what else I can add to that. America's image in the Middle East is not a good one, Amal, as you know, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, predominantly. Lately because of the Iraq War, also 10 years ago. So America, to an average Arab, America is the last person to tell an Arab how to do reform or how to do democracy. And I mean, I never thought about it in the way you presented it, countries with the least American. I never thought about it this way. But whatever the case is, I go back to my main point, is I don't think the outside community is anything but marginal to this process.
I would add one thing, Amal, that Marwan alluded to in his talk. What can the United States do? And I believe in simply one thing. I would, double the aid to the American University in Cairo and the American University in Beirut and every other institution based on the American education model of pluralistic thinking, pluralistic student body, pluralistic culture. And I would take all the military aid and convert it into scholarships for Arab young men and women who want to come study in a pluralistic society. And then I would just get out. The rest will take care of itself. It's not about what we do. It's about what they do. couple more. Do you have to go, Marwan? Do you have,
No,
what,
we have time.
Yeah, please.
10 minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kay Larkin with ConocoPhillips. I'm almost afraid to ask why you haven't talked about Libya and where Libya fits
Good
in the
question. Yeah,
modeling
thank you.
that you've done, and maybe some predictions on where it might go. Thanks.
The honest answer is I'm not an expert on Libya. That's the honest answer. Libya is, I don't know if Fred is not here, our expert on Libya. Libya is a sort of an anomaly among North African countries of the Arab world in the sense that it is tribal in nature. It also suffers from the same problem that the Eastern Arab world suffers from, which is there's no national Libyan identity. There are, sub-identities. Gaddafi made sure there's nothing in the country in terms of a bureaucracy, an army, civil society, what have you, and there's nothing. They have money, of course, but money is not everything. And so Libya, I think, will also continue to suffer for quite a long time.
Thanks. Dale Lautenbach from the World Bank. Marwan, congratulations on your book, and especially when you take it home in Arabic. You raised the demographic issue, which is so important, the youth demographic, the 70%. And I just wondered, within that 70%, given that, the huge rates of unemployment, the legacy of the education system, etc., what percentage of the 70% is available to the sort of modern discourse that you speak about? I mean, I think sometimes I worry that we get a little bit seduced by Facebook and Twitter, and we think, there are lots of young people who have these sort of very good ideas, but there is also the sort of the pull into al-Nusra and any other ideology that's available out there.
Yeah.
How do you get that dialogue going in, not necessarily in the majority, but with enough clamor?
That's a very, very important question, Dale. And I don't have statistics. And my intuition is that just because, you are young in the Arab world does not mean you are liberal or you are democratic. There's no reason to be liberal and democratic, once again, if you are not brought up believing in these principles. So definitely, there's probably a majority of the youth are not liberal and democratic in the Arab world. But there is I think, enough of a constituency that is liberal and democratic, that at least wants to be liberal and democratic. There is enough of a constituency to work with. But it's not a majority and will not be a majority for decades. And that is why I keep going back to the issue of developing the discourse. This discourse of believing in, a civil state and in democratic norms at all times is not a discourse that is anywhere a majority in the Arab world. Secular forces, the traditional secular forces, unfortunately, have been more liberal than democratic. And there's a difference between the two. And they showed us exactly how that difference is. And the religious forces have also, of course, not been liberal and democratic. I mean, there are, even within the religious groups, there are certain subgroups that are starting to argue that they need to do things differently. And I think that will grow because the street is going to increasingly demand that. But once again, this is something that will have to be worked at. It will not come up just like that. I talk to a lot of youth groups in Jordan, for example, and that is why I principally want to work with them. Not all of them agree with me. Not all of them, believe in what I'm saying, but there are good groups, good constituencies that do.
Mike. Wait for the mic.
Marwan, Mike Van Dusen, Wilson Center. One of the elephants in the room is the Sunni-Shia issue. And it's been going on, I guess it goes back to Zia and some of his policies and then the Iranian Revolution and whatnot. It's clear that Shiism is in ascendancy in the region and Sunni Islam is in disarray at the moment. My question is, how long do you think it will take for these forces to reach some new equilibrium? Are we talking about decades?
Yes, we are talking about decades. I've always viewed the Sunni-Shiite divide not as an entirely religious divide. It's a political divide. I mean, these people on the street are not fighting over their religious differences. They're fighting over political issues. They're fighting over citizenship issues sometimes. Some of them are fighting over religious issues. I mean, I don't want to downplay this, but I don't think the issue is entirely religious. If you take a country like Bahrain, and you have a new social contract, right, where 70% of the country, which is Shiite, are given equal rights, I don't see a reason why the Bahrainis, the Sunni Bahrainis and the Shiite Bahrainis should fight. Or a country like Saudi Arabia, where 10% are Shiites, and they are given equal rights. I mean, the list goes on. As long as you have these sub-identities trump over national identities, whether it is Sunni Shiite, whether it is Muslim Christian, whether it is Arab Kurd, whether it is whatever it is, then the Arab world has no hope. We cannot talk about prosperity in the Arab world anymore while we treat, parts of the population as less than equal citizens. We cannot do this anymore. We've done it for the longest time and got away with it. We cannot get away with it anymore. How many years, decades will it take to internalize this fact? I don't know. I don't think years, certainly decades, and I don't think it will end up well everywhere. I think, Lebanon has struggled with this for hundreds of years without a solution.
Marwan, I'm going to ask you this be the last question because we're 10 after 10.
Mohammed Al-Minshawi from the Middle East Institute and Egyptian Ashruk. Marwan, you 3 years plus to the Egypt revolution, struggle still between the military and the Islamists in the end. And I understand it's easy to blame the Islamic forces, but what about non-Islamic secular forces in Egypt? What went wrong with them 3 years plus? They are no place to be found.
I'm not blaming the Islamists in Egypt. I'm blaming both. I'm saying both in Egypt, both the Islamist forces and the secular forces have behaved in extremely exclusionist ways. I frankly am shocked at some of the secular forces in Egypt and individuals who I have a lot of respect for. I am shocked at the way they talk these days in an extremely non-inclusive manner. So I'm not really blaming the Islamists. I don't think that the whole process in Egypt was done the right way. I think the Islamists, when they were in power, used elections to think that they could, have their views prevail over all of society, used one snapshot in time to think that this gives them the right to do this. But the secular forces today in Egypt are behaving in the same exclusionist manner that they have accused the Islamists of behaving like last year. What is the secular argument? That the Islamists will come to power and never relinquish it. Well, give me a secular government that relinquished power in the Arab world. Give me one. Other than Lebanon for other reasons. Give me one. So, we cannot hold people to higher standards than everybody else. We have to have rules of engagement applied to all, secular and Islamist alike. But as I told you, I don't have much faith in the Islamist forces or the traditional secular forces. They have behaved in very short-sighted ways, in my view.
Well, Marwan, this has been an incredibly intelligent discussion. I really can't thank you enough. And as you go back to Jordan to bring these ideas there. I think we all wish you well, and always remember that pessimists are usually right. Optimists are usually wrong, but all great change in history was done by optimists. So thank you very much.
Thank you.